Welcome back to the Career Therapy Podcast, where we explore the intersection of work and well-being. I am your host, Coach Marty, and each episode I interview mental health experts, coaches, and industry insiders to bring you practical insights and tips that will help you build a meaningful, rewarding, and sustainable career. So join me as we explore the path to career satisfaction, one conversation at a time. In today's episode, we sit down with Natasha D'Arcangelo, a seasoned professional and speaker in the field of mental health counseling. Natasha is a compassion fatigue expert and serves as a qualified supervisor providing outpatient counseling for Headspace Health. Together, we discuss compassion fatigue in the caregiving professions, such as nursing, therapy, education, and more. And throughout our discussion, we dig into the impacts of trauma, the effects of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and ways in which you can train your nervous system to be more tolerant of perceived threats in both your life and the workplace. If you're enjoying the Career Therapy Podcast, please leave us a review on Spotify or iTunes and share this episode with someone you know who is struggling with burnout at work or in their job search, so we can help more people navigate their way to a better career. Thanks for tuning in. Now it's time for a discussion with Natasha D'Arcangelo. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to chat with you about compassion fatigue and burnout, especially when it comes to people who are working in caregiver roles in the mental health field or really anything that's people-oriented, which is a lot of jobs these days. As we dig into things, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of a background on you and how you got into the world of mental health.
Sure. So, hi, everybody. Natasha D'Arcangelo. I use she, her pronouns. I am a former educator, actually. So I was a teacher once upon a time. And what happened was I was really frustrated being in the classroom. I was living in New York at the time and felt like there was too much of a focus on state exams and state testing. And I wasn't really able to meet the needs of my students. And so in the process, it's a longer story, but let's just say I moved down to Florida and started working for Argosy University. One of the benefits was that I got to go to school for free. So I said, hey, you don't have to ask me twice if I want a free master's degree. And I was going to do school counseling or school psychology because all of my professional experience had been working with kids between, the classroom and, 10 years at the Boys and Girls Club. And one of my colleagues said, why don't you do a clinical mental health counseling degree? Then you can work with a much wider, population, audience. And I said, oh, well, that makes sense. And I'm really, really glad that I did, because now I work primarily with adults, which is not something I would have ever anticipated for myself. But, it was kind of this, I knew that there was something more that I wanted to be able to help my students with. And it felt to me like the missing piece was the mental health services. It's really hard, regardless of how good a teacher you are, if you've got a classroom full of students who are depressed or who are anxious or, everything like that. So the mental health route just seemed to make more sense to me. And I do actually work presently with adolescents and adults, and the teens that I work with are just my absolute favorite humans. They are so smart, so self-aware, so involved in things that I was not involved in when I was 16. It feels good to know that we're leaving the planet in good hands.
That's amazing. And, I appreciate you talking about how the biggest barriers or some of the barriers you came up upon in your teaching was that, there's the actual rote learning, but then there's the emotional things that get in the way of that. And we talk about that a lot in the career development space where, everyone knows they need a resume or knows they need to interview or knows they need to network, but there's these blockers, these different emotional blockers or whatever it might be, mental mindset blockers, whatever, where there's just this thing in the way of people being able to do the things that they need to do in order to, get things done or move things forward. And I'm curious, as you're working with students and adults and you're seeing them kind of know what their goals are, or you're helping them define their goals and move towards them, what are the most common barriers that come up that get in the way? What are the biggest blockers, emotional blockers that get in the way of people being able to make progress? And how do you typically categorize the different types of things people often encounter?
So I would say emotional barriers are people's own it's their self-talk. It's oh, excuse me. That might be a sneeze. It's their self-talk. A lot of people come to me feeling like they're broken. They are defective. There's just something inherently wrong with them. And what I work a lot with folks on is being able to help them understand themselves a little bit better. You're not broken, you're not defective, you've experienced a really significant amount of trauma in your life. And what I specialize in trauma treatment. And what ends up happening as a result of all of that trauma is it recalibrates your nervous system. So you don't want to be acting this way. I know it feels like you go from 0 to 100, and maybe you are flying off the handle with your kids. You're not the parent that you want to be, or you're not the partner that you want to be to, your romantic partner, because you're just so defensive and you don't want to be, but it's like you keep defaulting to that and you don't know why. So it's helping folks understand, we can work around that. We can use your nervous system to your advantage. But I think that there's just this huge lack of knowledge of really normalizing things like that, right? There's this conception out there that even if a trauma happens, let's say something happens to you when you're 7 years old, that you can get over it. And I don't know who these magical people are that decided that was a thing, but the truth is it doesn't matter how old you are when the trauma occurs, it continues to live on in your nervous system, even if it's not something that you're consciously thinking about on a daily basis. So, the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that's exactly what it talks about. And most people are not aware of that connection. So I think it's this lack of knowledge, honestly, of even how our bodies work, how our nervous systems work. So really try to normalize that for folks. And I do think another big one is shame. There's a lot of stigma around seeking out mental health care, especially among certain BIPOC communities. There's this philosophy, I'm Guyanese, I'm first generation American. Well, my mom would say I'm Guyanese American. And the perception in Guyana is you don't go and talk to a complete stranger about your problems. That has to stay within the family unit, right? And, if you go to talk to somebody, well, then you must be crazy. There can be no other possible solution. And I do think that is very common, in addition to, the United States healthcare system is completely broken. And we have a national shortage of mental health providers. And so let's say that you come to the point where you're like, I really do think I need to talk to a professional. Now you have to navigate your health insurance to try to figure out, do you even get coverage? If so, they're going to dictate how many sessions you get a year. The insurance company is going to dictate what diagnoses you can even receive treatment for. And then many therapists don't even want to be paneled with insurance companies because of the administrative burden of becoming a paneled provider in the first place, and then the battle on the back end to try to get reimbursement for services provided. So it's hard to find somebody that's in network that meets your parameters and that is currently accepting new clients. So there's just so many things that get in the way of people really being able to access the care that they need.
Gosh, you've definitely opened up a lot of doors for us to walk down, and I can't wait to dig in. I'm so glad you mentioned The Body Keeps the Score and the nervous system brain connection, because as a teacher, a lot of times, we focus on getting the knowledge into people's heads, right? And I think one of the things I've seen in a lot of my conversations is you can know a lot of things, but still not be able to do them, right? Like we know,
Yes.
Getting outside for a walk and seeing the sun in the morning is great for us, right?
Yep.
But doing that and getting our body and mind to work together, again, The Body Keeps the Score is a great book. Everyone should definitely go read it if you're interested
Yes.
in these topics. But even after reading that book, it's not like, oh, I read the book, life is fixed,
Now
right? Like,
everything's all better. Right.
right.
Yeah.
And so, you talk about how we're not showing up as the parent, the partner, and in my case, with my clients, the worker that we want to be showing up as in these different situations. And a lot of times it is that trauma response that is preventing us from being able to do that. So you mentioned that we can use our nervous system to our advantage. What do you mean by that? And how have you seen people do that in their work or in their lives?
So that's one of the things I love to help people with. So I'm a certified compassion fatigue professional and a compassion fatigue educator. So I will talk about compassion fatigue all day, every day, if you let me. A really, really good resource on compassion fatigue is Dr. Eric Gentry. He is the co-founder of the Forward Facing Institute. I happen to have his most recent publication here. So Forward Facing Professional Resilience. And he has done over 25 years of research specifically on caregivers and how we end up in compassion fatigue. So here's what ends up happening with many of the folks that I work with who are professional caregivers. So I'm talking about teachers, physicians, mental health professionals, nurses, law enforcement, first responders, those kinds of things. I know that's not a comprehensive list, but just to start with. So it always amazes me, especially when I talk to mental health professionals. So I do public speaking on the side of my full-time gig, and I do a number of continuing education presentations to mental health professionals on compassion fatigue. I have never done one of those continuing education presentations without having at least one person come up to me and say, I had no idea that my own nervous system is what led me to be neck deep in compassion fatigue. They don't teach us this stuff in school as mental health professionals. They certainly, the nurses that I've worked with that have gone to nursing school, they don't talk about it. The physicians that I've worked with, they don't teach them that in med school. I have yet to meet a single teacher where they've ever talked about compassion fatigue in a professional setting or in their training. So it's about understanding that you do not live in a vacuum, right? And I want you to think about those of us that choose caregiving roles as a profession. We do this stuff because we want to help other people, right? I've always known that I wanted to be a helper. My grandma loves to tell the story of when I was 4 and my brother was born. I didn't want him to be a brother. I wanted him to be a sister because in my 4-year-old wisdom, I told my grandma he was supposed to be a girl because I'm going to be the teacher and she's going to be the nurse. So apparently at 4, I knew I was going to be a caregiver. We want to help people. That's why we do this. But in the position of wanting to help people, we are uniquely predestined in a way to develop compassion fatigue because we care so much. And it's that, and Dr. Gentry loves to say, helping doesn't have to hurt. You're going to hear me quote Dr. Gentry a lot. I've done a lot of training with him. I have incredible respect for the man and his work. But helping doesn't have to hurt. And I didn't know that until I found Dr. Gentry's trainings. Now I know I can retire from this field. I didn't always know that for a fact, that I was going to be able to do this until I chose to walk away from counseling as a profession. I thought I had a limited amount of time, which is what I always heard from everybody in the field. You can only be a therapist for X amount of years because it's going to burn you out. You're not going to be able to do this for forever. So here's what oftentimes ends up happening with caregivers. We have had something or a series of things happen to us, oftentimes in early childhood, that led us to the thought that we want to help other people. So, I find that especially true for folks that are mental health professionals. Maybe we experienced a significant amount of trauma as a child. Maybe we grew up in a home where there was domestic violence. Maybe we had a caregiver who was addicted to substances, right? And so we grow up and we say, I want to be able to help people in those situations. And it's that very history of trauma that when you're sitting in a session with a client, activates your nervous system, not consciously. It's not a decision that you're making. But let's say, for example, you have experienced, I'll go back to my domestic violence situation. We'll just throw out a theoretical there. So you lived in a home where you witnessed domestic violence frequently, right? That's your experience of growing up. And then you have a client come to you, and this client says to you, I think I have some trauma from my childhood that I really need to work on. And they start talking about how they grew up in a household where they witnessed domestic violence on a frequent basis. What's happening in your nervous system as you sit in session with this person is your nervous system is screaming at you that you need to fight or flight, because it's triggering all of these things that you remember, or at least your nervous system remembers, from having grown up witnessing this domestic violence. So what ends up happening is you're now sitting in session, not consciously, I do want to emphasize that, but you're now sitting in session in a body that is tense because your nervous system is telling you need to fight or flight, and you're ignoring it because you're in session with this client and you can't go anywhere. So you put your therapist face on and you try to be as connected and yet disconnected as you possibly can so that you can make it through this session, right? And oftentimes you got another client right after that. So there's no rebound. There's no opportunity to process or debrief or go take a walk or stand in the sun for a moment, right? You've got other things that you need to do. And we do this day after day, narrative after narrative. And what ends up happening is it builds up in your system over time. And you end up neck deep in compassion fatigue. And you find that you don't have empathy for your clients anymore. You don't have patience for your family anymore. You're turning down invitations to go do things. You're thinking about quitting your job, or you're at least dreading going to your job in the morning. You're questioning if this is even what you want to be doing. And that's just a brief snapshot of some symptoms of compassion fatigue. So what I try to help folks do is understand that there's nothing wrong with you. Let's think about your history of trauma and the things that you've experienced. So one of the things I always have folks do is take their ACEs. That's the adverse childhood experiences. And we use that just as a baseline to get an idea of what kind of things happened before you were 18. What happened as all of those connections were being formed in your brain? And then we apply that to present day. Once you have an understanding that the way you show up in a session, if your ACEs score is 9, is very different than the way you show up in a session if your ACEs score is 1, right? Now, you can be an absolutely wonderful, fantastic therapist if you have an ACEs score of 9. I'd be predisposed to say you'd be a more effective therapist because you just have such great insight because of the things that happened, right? If you understand what's happening inside your nervous system as you're listening to these narratives that your clients are telling you. So half of the battle is being keyed in to what's happening inside your body and recognizing that muscle tension is your nervous system's first giveaway that you have activated your panic response, right? So it is an internal response to external stimuli. In my example, the external stimuli being your clients sharing this narrative with you. If you're able to, and this is what I teach clients to do, relax those involuntarily constricted muscles, you interrupt your threat response. Now, in a situation like this hypothetical I set up with this domestic violence, you may have to relax those involuntarily constricted muscles maybe like 30 times throughout that session. But what ends up happening is if you stay in a relaxed body, if you keep relaxing those muscles, your nervous system does not think that present day you are in danger by sitting and sharing space with this client. You can actually remain more present if you relax the muscles of your body, as opposed to sitting there kind of gritting your teeth and like, okay, have to get through this. There's only 30 minutes of the session left, which is what most of us do. So long answer,
I
but
love it though.
yes.
There's so many places we can go. So this is such an interesting thing because um when it comes to relaxing ourselves, I tend to notice that in my own experience, there's early on in the process of going to therapy and learning about these things and trying to realize, the fight flight response and everything like that. One of the things I noticed is that, and maybe this is a feeling a lot of people share, I've never known what it's like to not be tense at that time.
Yes.
And and
Yep.
what I found very interesting about that, and more and more recently as I've been getting into somatic work versus just CBT work, in the CBT, I was like, I intellectually understand what's happening, but I have no idea what to do.
Cognitively, I get it.
Exactly. It's like I rationally can like say, this is how I, should be. But the body doesn't follow along. And that's the whole body keeps the score piece. And I think this happens a lot in the workplace as well, where people are like, I know that this interview is not the end of the world intellectually, but my body is like, if I don't do everything perfect in the next 30 minutes, my life is over. Right. And so,
yeah.
Because that judgment and that rejection and that fear. And so as I got more into the somatic work, and I can even think of a moment recently where I, got worked up about something. Maybe someone didn't join a call, or I don't know what the thing was. And I was just like pacing around. I was like, oh, wait a second. I'm in the trauma response right now. I was able to actually, catch it in the moment. Yes. And actually it happened this morning. I was trying to figure out, I was like, I'm dog sitting this dog. I got to get something to eat. I have a podcast coming up. And I'm like, oh, I'm like in a nervous system.
It's happening right
exactly.
now.
It's happening right now.
You're dysregulated.
Exactly. And what I want us to dig into here is like, so people are, let's say they absorb the knowledge and now they want to start putting it into practice, right? To give yourself that ability to relax your body. So what I did this morning was sit on a meditation pillow and just kind of like do some somatic hand movements. And it calmed me down just enough to go, okay, I'm just going to get food from this place and walk around the block this way. And now I have a plan. But what are some of the things that people can do to connect, to make that connection and to get themselves into a relaxed state, especially if they've never really been in a relaxed state or they don't even know what that feels like?
Yeah, which is almost everybody that comes to me. If your baseline is panic and I come along and I tell you to relax into your body, I'm now the threat. I am now the thing that's initiating your threat response, right? So one of the things that I always tell clients when we start this work is it's going to feel weird and it's going to feel uncomfortable because what I'm asking you to do is undo the 40 years of learning that your nervous system has put together in order to keep you alive. That's why this is happening. Because when you were young, you learned that when people are yelling at each other, that's a dangerous situation, right? So present day, flash forward to, you had to do a Target run on a Sunday and there's just two people in the parking lot screaming at each other and you start to have a panic attack. Now you're coming to session with me and you're like, why am I not over this? Why does this keep happening to me, right? What we need to do is we need to help your nervous system understand that right now you are not about to die, even if these strangers in the Target parking lot are yelling at each other. Because what's happening is your nervous system is going back to 6-year-old you or 7-year-old you and thinking that it needs to protect you from that situation. So bear with me here. The fact that you're initiating a panic response is actually your nervous system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's just trying really, really hard to keep you alive. Mm-hmm. So what I always do when I start working with clients, and I would recommend that everybody watch, first of all, Dr. Gentry has a whole YouTube channel. So he's got a ton of things out there available for free. Everything that he has available on his YouTube channel, well worth the watch. I think if you watch all of the videos, it's between 7 and 8 hours. It's well worth the watching. But if you don't have that time commitment, Jenny Brackman, Brackman. She is the co-founder of the Forward Facing Institute. And she's done about a 40-minute video called Tools for Hope, available for free on YouTube. And she kind of goes through exactly what I'm explaining, which is the panic response, your nervous system. And she also practices with you in that video some body relaxation techniques. But before we even get to the part, and this is where almost everybody that I work with has not had this piece of knowledge, body relaxation techniques will not help you if your body thinks you're about to die. So before you try any kind of body relaxation techniques, this is why I love when I have clients come in and they're like, don't tell me to meditate. Meditation is not going to work for me. And I'm like, no, because your body thinks you're going to die. I don't care how long you try to meditate for. It's not going to work, right? So, well, the first thing that we do is we have to understand what's going on inside your nervous system. So I still have my stack of things here from that presentation that I just did. So I'm just pulling from there. So what we do is we make a list of causes and effects. And what I have them do is I have them list what are the negative effects of stress on your mind and on your body. And I get things like, oh, I can't sleep and I'm yelling at my kids and, I'm going to lose my job and, I'm clenching my teeth and I have these migraines and my stomach is upset. And so I have suicidal thoughts, right? I mean, we make a really comprehensive list and I say, okay, great job. Thanks for that. Now I want you to think about what are the causes of stress in your life? My job, my family, the state of the world. A year or two ago, it was COVID, fear of failure, right? I don't want to have a panic attack when I'm in public. And we make a list of those things. And then I say, okay, great. Now here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a look at the list of causes that you just wrote down. And I want you to tell me what things on that list are currently posing a life-threatening danger to you. And I usually get, I don't know, my health. And I'm like, okay, what's going on with your health right now in this very moment that's causing you a life-threatening danger? Well, I mean, not right now, but, I have high blood pressure. And I'm like, okay, so you have high blood pressure, but right now in this moment, it's not killing you? Okay. What else? And we go through it until we've kind of gone through everything. And then they're like, oh, well, I guess nothing on the list is posing a life-threatening danger to me. And I'm like, aha, that's what I want you to hold on to. The only thing that really qualifies as a cause of stress is something that in the moment is literally posing a life-threatening danger to you, not something that has the potential to be a life-threatening danger. That's the difference. So what's happened is your nervous system has learned some inaccurate messaging about what is a real threat and what is a perceived threat. Not your fault. You didn't sign up for that. And so it's causing you a lot of distress in present day. I mean, look at that list of effects that you just wrote down. That's not fun. So what we just need to do is we need to help your nervous system be able to understand, is it a real threat or is it a perceived threat? If you're not literally about to die, it's a perceived threat, even if it has the potential to kill you. That happens at work too. If I had a nurse that I was working with a few years ago, that one of the doctors that she worked with was just constantly screaming at her. You can imagine that triggered her panic response and she was just ready to walk off the job. Once I explained this to her, she was able to make the connection to some of her childhood experiences and understand why this doctor was triggering her threat response. So the next time the doctor yelled at her, she thought to herself, you know what? Right now, this is a perceived threat. I'm not literally about to die, and it's not worth me losing my job today. So the first thing we have to do is help your nervous system understand that you're not literally about to die, right? So sometimes, depending on the client, here's my visual aid that I use. I'll say when I worked with people in person, I would have them list for me the things in my office that are dangerous. And they would always tell me that the scissors that I had on my desk were dangerous. And I would say, yes. Are they hurting me or you right now? No. So these are a perceived threat. Think about how many things in your life are actually a perceived threat, right? And what's happened to every single one of us, regardless of how high or low your ACEs score is, your nervous system has classified things incorrectly. Here's what I mean by that. There's two buckets. There's the bucket of things that will kill you, and there's the bucket of things that won't kill you. All of us have things in our bucket of things that will kill us that won't, right? If you got bitten by a dog, prior to that, you absolutely loved dogs. What's going to happen is you're going to develop a fear of all dogs, right? Because your nervous system is trying very hard to protect you. The only way you're going to be able to resolve this fear of dogs is by encountering a dog in a nervous system that knows that right now, in this present moment, you are not in life-threatening danger. And then we introduce a body relaxation technique. So I love it when I do this with clients and then they come back to me a session or two later and they tell me, because this is always their homework assignment, before the next time I see you, I want you to come back to me with two things: a moment where you were able to successfully self-regulate and a moment where you were not able to successfully self-regulate. And I love the examples because they'll come back to me and they'll say, oh, I got an email from my boss about how they want to meet with me at 2:00 and it wasn't on my calendar. And I started doing the thing and I was overthinking it and I could feel my body going there. And then I thought to myself, you know what, though? It's just an email and I'm not in life-threatening danger. And I always clap and I'm like, yay, you recognized it. And so you didn't spend all morning playing it over and over and over and over again in your head. Didn't that feel much better to then walk into that meeting with that kind of energy, right? So that's what we're always trying to get to. And then I introduce the body relaxation techniques. Once we establish, is it a real threat or is it a perceived threat? The first one that Dr. Gentry always teaches is the wet noodle, where what we do is you have your client, a presentation, I'll do it with a room full of people, whomever. Do a quick scan of your body from head to toe. Pretend like you're standing and looking at yourself and just take stock of where in your body are you tense right now? Where are your muscles involuntarily constricted? And as I asked that question, I realized that for me right now, it's my shoulders. But as I previously established, I'm sitting in my home office. My puppy is asleep under the desk. I am not in immediate life-threatening danger. There is no need for my muscles to be tense right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do another body scan. But this time, as I slowly scan from my head to my feet, I'm going to count from 1 to 5. And I'm going to soften up all of the muscles in my body and then just see what happens, right? So I invite people to do that as I count 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And for maybe 70% of people, they're like, oh, I felt a shift. Maybe your shoulders dropped a little bit. Maybe you realize you were carrying some tension in your jaw. And that is really effective for them. But I have a not insignificant amount of clients who don't know what it's like to be in a relaxed body, which is why I like to do the pelvic floor relaxation with them. So for the pelvic floor relaxation, I have them locate 2 places or 4 places on their body. So the first 2 are right in front, and I actually have them touch it, like when we're sitting in session, be it in office or Zoom. And I'm like, okay, put your hands on those hip bones where they stick out in the front. Okay, perfect. Now get your hands up underneath you, get your hands up under your butt. And I want you to locate the 2 places as you're sitting where your bones stick out, right? And now what we're going to do is we're going to play a visual game, like a visual image of connecting the dots. Let's connect those 4 points that you just touched on your body. You make a box inside your pelvis. Now your box is at an angle because those hip bones are up higher than those bones that you're sitting on. You have a lot of muscles inside that box. One in particular is your pelvic floor muscles. So fastest way to locate them is, if you've ever been to the doctor's office and had to pee inside one of those little cups, it's those muscles that you use to stop peeing midstream, because that's a, gender neutral, everybody gets that. The clients that I've worked with who have birthed humans, they know what their pelvic floor muscles are. So we locate that. And then what I ask them to do is, I want you to tighten it up for 5 seconds while I count. And when I hit 5, what I'm going to ask you to do is let it go, relax it, and then try to get that relaxed feeling to fill up that box that you've made inside your pelvis. And those clients that don't have a lot of experience with being in a relaxed body, this exercise helps them get there because they need the contrast between the tension and then the relax in order to say, oh, now I get it. But it doesn't take more than 5 seconds to interrupt your threat response. And imagine navigating through your workday, even if you have a doctor that's yelling at you, or you're a teacher and they have one parent that emails you every hour upon the hour, right? You still have the choice to self-regulate, always. You always are able to control what's happening inside your body. So they may continue doing their nonsense, right? That is on them. You get to decide how you respond. And it doesn't have to be coming from that place of your previous trauma, which is where you've come to me. But now you know, and so now you can do things differently. And imagine what a difference that'll make for you. And it's just so gratifying to me when people come back and they tell me, so I self-regulate. I have a client right now who just recently got back into the dating scene after a pretty gnarly breakup. And we actually talked to each other recently, and he's dating again and got into an argument with their new partner. And he was able to actually communicate what was frustrating and upsetting to him in the moment. And I looked at him and I'm like, did you self-regulate? And he said, yes, I did. And I was like, yay. Previously that would have been very triggering for him, right?
Yeah.
But because he's able to self-regulate, he was able to remain in the present moment and communicate what he needed to say to his partner. So
there's so many incredible things in what you went through there, and I appreciate you sharing those specific techniques for people, and I hope some folks were able to follow along. I know I was trying to as you were talking with the countdown.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of like times in my 20s when I was definitely much more heightened in every single way. And I heard about pelvic floor exercises around that time and had tried to do some of those. And similar to what you're saying, it's like I didn't have anyone guiding me through it, so I was just trying to figure it out on my own. And I was like, where is this? What's going on? What does it feel like? And like, even just like, I over time you start to realize like, wow, this tension, I've always had tension in my shoulders. I've always had tension in my back, or I've always had tension. Like, I think even at that time I realized I was like clenching my ass like at all times. Like, and I'm like always holding a fart, I guess, like decades, that isn't because there.
Your nervous system is like, something is happening.
It's so
something
funny.
Is going on.
And it's like, it's like we got to run at any given moment. And it makes me like, number one, to see like, okay, I have made some progress, but then we talk about some of these other things. I'm like, okay, there's still ways to go. But also like, what is it about these early traumas when they aren't actually life-threatening traumas in the first place? So like, I know pretty well what some of the things that, happened to me that dictated a lot of what I'm dealing with these days. I have a pretty good sense of it, but like, it wasn't life-threatening at the time, but it was interpreted as life-threatening. So why is it that we're interpreting these things that aren't life-threatening as life-threatening, and then reinterpreting them as future things as life-threatening because of that? It just seems like, it seems so odd that like, a social interaction that hurt you, like maybe being cheated on or something, like how that can be interpreted as life-threatening, maybe because it's hitting our ego, or it's hitting our identity, or it's hitting betrayal or some other thing within us. What is that? What's making that life-threatening connection? Is it I'll let you take it from there. What do you think is causing these non-life-threatening things to be interpreted as life-threatening?
So that's a great question. And what I try to help folks to understand is this: your amygdala, right, which is the part of your brain that helps it's your threat detection system. It serves like your smoke detector. Your smoke detector's job is not to differentiate between, did you burn your toast or are there flames shooting out of your toaster oven, right? It doesn't make a different noise. All it does is sound the alarm that it has detected smoke, right? So what your amygdala does is it sounds the alarm as soon as it detects danger. Your brain essentially is a great big computer. There's an analogy I came up with a month ago that I'm really proud of because it's been working for a lot of people. And what I say to them is when you've experienced this stuff, especially in early childhood, you had this corrupt virus uploaded into your system. And every single time that you self-regulate, it's like you're doing Norton on yourself and you're just kind of flushing out that virus. But you don't do that one time, do you? No, you have to consistently run some kind of virus checking program in order for your laptop to continue working optimally, right? I don't work in IT, so anybody that works in IT, if that is a wrong analogy, I apologize. Feel free to email me and correct me. But that's been helping a lot of people really get it, right? So the other thing I want you to keep in mind is so much of brain development happens in those early years, especially those ages between like 0 and 5, really even 0 and 2. Your brain is literally making neuron connections at astounding speeds. And so that ends up becoming your roadmap for how you will then interact with your universe for the rest of your life until you come to see somebody like yourself or myself, right? And as beautiful as that is, your brain is still developing. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense in order for it to get placed into the bucket of things that will kill you. It just has to have enough of an environmental stimulus for it to get placed into the bucket of things that will kill you. So here's an example that I gave in the CEU presentation I did last week. My middle nephew is 3 years old, loves pancakes. It's really an excuse to eat maple syrup. If I take him out to breakfast on a Sunday morning and we eat outside and he gets stung by a bee, he may develop an aversion to maple syrup. Wasn't the maple syrup that hurt him, but it was part of the sensory experience that hurt him. Yeah. So think about how many hundreds or thousands of examples you have in your life where, because of the other sensory input that your system received, something as simple as maple syrup can get classified into the bucket of things that will kill you. And the goal of self-regulation is not to figure out what's causing your panic response. The goal of self-regulation is to become aware of what's happening in your body so that you know when your muscles are involuntarily constricted and interrupting your threat response, because you know right now, regardless of what your nervous system is picking up on, you are not actually in life-threatening danger. And this is not the kind of thing that I ever expect people to get perfect at, you know, as amazing and life-changing as Dr. Gentry's teachings have been for me. I don't self-regulate perfectly 100% of the time. Now, the days when I do self-regulate and I'm really on it and I'm like, yeah, I am firing on all cylinders today, I do feel better. But then there are days where I'm not self-regulating as well and I'm, you know, done and I'm like, oh, I need a nap, you know? So the goal of this is never to be perfect at it. The goal of this is that, are you tracking in the direction of self-regulation? Because if you are, I promise you, your quality of life will improve and all of your relationships will improve. Your relationships with your colleagues, with your boss, with your kids, with your partner, with your friends, because you're going to be able to recognize that even if your friend tells you, I don't know, you know, ugh, is that what you're going to wear to the wedding? Right. You're not like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of money on, and then you start doing the spiral thing. Right.
Yeah.
You can self-regulate through that. Is it uncomfortable? Yes. Does it require a threat response? No.
Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by Career Therapy's Unstuck coaching program, which was built to give you the personalized support you need to advance in your career without fear and turn work-related anxiety into professional accomplishments. When you enroll in the Unstuck coaching program's monthly membership, you get immediate access to all of the coaching resources you need to crush it in your job search. This includes 2 one-on-one calls with Coach Marty every month, weekly job search support group sessions with the Unstuck community, access to the Unstuck curriculum, which guides you through every aspect of your job search from strategy through negotiations, and an invite to the Career Therapy Slack channel where you can chat with Coach Marty whenever job search questions come up. Want to see if the Unstuck coaching program is right for you? Head over to careertherapy.com and schedule a free consultation with me in order to find out. And I think it's also important for people to realize that this might happen differently in different situations. So like you might actually get a pretty good handle on, let's say, friendships, but then a relationship triggers you and you're like, oh, I thought I got this, right? Or you're really good at it in your personal life, but then at work, you're extra triggered because it's your, income and sense of security. And so you might have to go through this whole process beginning to end in different situations as you're learning it. And so one of the things that as we dig into all of this, we're hitting on all these threats and perceived threats and traumas and trying to figure out the causes and the effects and dealing with all that. There's a lot of things that we can dig into here. But as we're bringing it back around to that fatigue piece, I am curious how, as people are trying to practice these things, sometimes to your point, we're not going to be perfect, right? So how can we continue to practice these things while giving ourselves grace and not burning out? I see mental health burning people out, or at least attempting to fix our mental health, burning people out. So there's a lot of different ways where when we start learning these things, we either think that we're better than we are, and then maybe start going, well, other people should be doing this too, right? And like that can create more cyclical thinking. And then there's also just like the realization that like I've been doing so much, I've been going to therapy for so many years. Why is it not like perfect yet, right? And you said it might never be perfect. What does it look like when people are almost getting burnt out in their self-care, in their attempts at improving, because they're trying to like make everything in their life smooth? Have you seen that? What ways does it show up, and how do you help people navigate those situations?
So, good question. For me, the goal is never perfection. The goal is that you're tracking towards self-regulation, right? When one of the things that Dr. Gentry covers in his compassion fatigue, any of the trainings that he does, is there are essentially 5 elements that he calls it, it's like those are the 5 pieces that need to be in place to help you develop some immunity to compassion fatigue. So it's not just one thing, but self-regulation is the foundation of that house, right? So that's the ability to recognize, I may be uncomfortable right now, but I'm not in life-threatening danger. So this does not require my threat response. The second piece of that is intentionality. So what happens with a lot of people is, and recovering people pleaser, I've been there myself, we're so focused on the external locus of control. We're trying to do our best for our job. We're trying to do our best for our boss, for our team, for the clients that we work with, right? But if you get really intentional about what you're doing, you can be principle-based rather than demand-driven. So I could talk about this for like an hour in and of itself, but essentially it's getting back to what are your core principles? What are your core values, right? So even if your hospital admins are telling you, you need to see, 50 patients in 2 hours, and I want your documentation done before your shift is done at the end of the day. For a lot of my caregivers, they're like, I can't be seeing, 50 people and then your colleagues are upset about it. So we're now all complaining about it, right? But here's the deal. Even if you don't see 50 patients and get all your notes done at the end of the day, you as a caregiver, as a nurse, your worth as a person does not inherently change. The most important thing is, Are you doing right by those patients? Because at the end of the day, isn't that why you became a nurse? To help people, right? So today I did my best, and my best is good enough. And if the hospital admin doesn't like it, most of those people in decision-making positions don't actually see patients. If the hospital doesn't like it, they can go suck eggs. Did you do your best? And if you did your best, then you succeeded, period. Another one of my gentryisms that I really like is, it is none of my business what other people think about me. Man, when he said that in one of my trainings, I was like, mind blown. What? I have no control over what other people think about me. I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I know that. But if I'm not your cup of tea, then you and I aren't destined to be friends together. It's not going to happen. But that doesn't make me a bad person, right? It just means that I'm not your cup of tea. So the other part of that is perceptual maturation. In every single situation, you have choice. Even in the situation, and some people are probably going to get rubbed wrong by this, even in the situation that I just made up with this hospital admin, right? You have the choice of whether or not you show up to work the next day. I know what you're going to say, but Natasha, I have a mortgage to pay. I understand that. But you still have the choice of whether or not you show up for work the next day. Because here's the thing, if you choose to not show up for work the next day, there are consequences to that action. Are you willing to live with the consequences of not showing up for work the next day? That's still a choice, right? So even if hospital admin is doing all this nonsense stuff, right? I feel like I'm singling out hospitals, but I work with a lot of nurses. So even if hospital, admins are doing shenanigans, you still choose showing up for your patients. You still choose what's happening inside your body when you're reading this email. And again, if you're doing your best, then you're winning. So there's an exercise that I do with folks that I got from Dr. Gentry where we write, I'll show you mine. I have them write out their mission statement. This is what drives me. This is why I do what I do every single day. My favorite sentence in my personal mission statement is, I will live my life according to my core mission that I am here to help others. So even if the powers that be at my job are making decisions that I don't think are in clients' best interests, if I am helping people, then I am succeeding, period. That's my intentionality, right? And so that's what I help people try to really be able to identify and get back to what they're able to control. It's also really important, I'm on number 4 of the the immunity stuff. It's also really important that you connect to other people. Nobody gets it like other nurses, like other doctors, like other mental health professionals. So you can say to them, listen, I heard this podcast today about compassion fatigue, and I did a little bit of digging, and I feel like this is something that I might be struggling with. So here's what I'm going to ask of you. I will be your support person to connect with if I notice you developing symptoms of compassion fatigue. Are you willing to have that kind of exchange with me? And you call me out if you notice things. I will probably get upset, but I'm going to ask you to push through that upsetness. Right? I may also need a person to go to if I've had a particularly tough day. Maybe I lost, 2 patients in one day, just really hard. I'm never going to call you up and just dump on you. I'm going to check with you ahead of time and say, hey, I had a really heavy day today. Are you in an emotional space to be able to support me if I give you a phone call? And I will do the same thing for you. You need that connection to at least one of your other colleagues. And then finally, the last piece is, as mental health professionals, the stuff that we tell clients to do all the time, where we tell them, you have to eat well, you have to sleep well, you have to do exercise, right? Those are things that are important for you to do as well. And those are the 5 keys to be able to develop an immunity to compassion fatigue. Think about it. If you're spending most of your days in panic response, you've got a lot of extra energy running through your body because of all your cortisol and adrenaline levels are up through the roof. Best way to help dissipate that is not to lay in bed staring at your ceiling for 2 hours every night. It's to do regular aerobic exercise, get it out of your body, flush it out, right? So it's all that stuff that I mean, I know I don't, there's not a week that goes by that I don't work on sleep hygiene with at least one of my clients. We need to do that stuff too.
Yeah, and I appreciate you talking about what to do when these things happen, because a big thing that I help people in my coaching practice work through is, if this happens, then what do you do? Right. So if you freeze up in the interview, what is the response pattern that you're going to train? So it's not just like sit there in silence staring at the screen, or if
Right.
if you ramble, how are you going to get back on track? What specific words will you use in that situation, so that when you're flooded with cortisol and all the adrenaline, like your brain goes, well, these words, just say these words, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so like having these if then statements, like if I get laid off, then my next step is, if my boss, critiques me, then my response will be, or how, having at least a set of things to choose from, I think is really
Yes.
helpful for people. And one of the things that you talk about, trying to be able to, a lot of, all of this is sort of rooted in trying to prevent what's happened in the past from happening again, or some other version of it. And there is no true way to prevent things from happening. And, this is something
we
that
have
I
no control over that.
I struggle with this too. And so it's like, at a certain point, we have to kind of accept the fact that even if we fully lived in our trauma responses 110% of the time, that still won't prevent things from happening. And it may just lead us to be very, very isolated, or or it might actually create the situations that we're trying to avoid. And a lot of what we're trying to do here is, the de-escalation of these responses, so that we can be more mindful and not recreate these situations. Or let's say, if something does happen, we go, let's say, if I'm in this situation again, where this thing happens again, then I can learn from my previous response and come up with a new way of responding and caring for myself in the future. And I think that that's a tough place to get to, but by doing all these things, by practicing all these things, and by continuing to remind ourselves that, like, at the end of the day, you got to have your own back no matter what's happening. Like, you might get laid off again, but that's a reality.
We can make a plan for that.
Yeah, we can make a plan, and we don't have to just live in this denial state that everything is fine until it's not, and then be surprised all the time.
Walking around in a panic state trying to prevent the layoff from happening does not work either. Because I have a lot of clients who have become so immersed in their panic response that they feel like the hypervigilance is helping them, and it's not, right? There's a meme that I saw in one of my therapy groups last year that came across and said, you never had control, what you had was anxiety. Right? It's the panic response is not preventing things from happening. It's getting in the way of you living the life that you really want to live.
Yeah. That's such a great thing to linger on. It's not actually helping. It's just giving you anxiety while these same things are still happening. And I think, to your point about being enmeshed, like, I think so often in our world today, with such knowledge of the mental health space and so much happening in the self-help world, we're giving people a language to then create identities around these things. And I think sometimes, and I've definitely been at fault of this, it's like, I am an anxious person versus I'm just a person who's having anxiety, and being able to separate those two. And I guess I'd love to just sort of end on if someone is at this point where, let's say, they're ready to start implementing certain practices here and learn how to do that relaxation techniques and do all these things. Maybe we could just end on a quick short story of someone that you've worked with who, on the other side of it, things aren't perfect, but they've actually seen like a real big change in how they show up. What can it look like? And obviously everyone's journey is different. It's going to take a different amount of time to get there, but what are some expectations that people can have so that, they don't think it's going to be an overnight fix, or they don't think it'll take 100 years. What are some of the realistic expectations and outcomes that people can maybe think about?
So I actually will use myself as an example. I was thinking the first person that came to mind was a nurse that I'd worked with, and then a teacher that I'd worked with, but also I feel like my public speaking journey is a really good example of this. So I was really, really shy in elementary school. I really struggled with perfectionism and people pleasing. And so I was terrified always to give presentations. I thought that was normal. I thought everybody wanted to throw up before they had to do a presentation. I don't think I realized that that wasn't so until much later on. Through the course of learning what I've learned, understanding my threat response, understanding where my fear of failure comes from, and how I came to perfectionism, for me, it's a coping skill. I felt like I had to be perfect at all the things, because if I wasn't perfect at all of the things, then bad things would happen to me. Again, not necessarily life-threatening things, but bad things would happen to me, right? So what I've come to learn now is that's my threat response. And so the reason that I'm able to actually do public speaking, me of, my goodness, 20 years ago would be mind blown by the fact that I present regularly to large groups of people now. And the reason that I'm able to do that is because I always regulate. Always. Before I log on, before I start the Zoom, before I walk into the room, or while I'm waiting for the audience to file in, if it's an in-person thing, I have to remind myself that it is not nothing that happens in this presentation is going to end up in the category of life-threatening danger. And I need to relax the muscles of my body. It has taken me, I did my first training with Dr. Gentry 3 years ago. So it has taken me this many years to get to this place. I still get anxious before almost every presentation. There's still a piece of me that's like, okay, it was at 1:00 that I said I was doing this, right? Oh, I can't find the link to the Zoom. And, what if people have questions? What if my internet goes out? My brain still does that stuff, but I'm able to now reel myself back in, come back to the present moment, and understand, even if I forget everything that I was supposed to say, right? All of my training just disappears from my brain. I'm not going to die. It's not a life-threatening situation. And the very fact that I'm able to recognize that allows me to connect with what's stored in my prefrontal cortex and share the information that I'm there to share. But it has been a process for me. And there are certain presentations, I don't know if the audience can necessarily hear it, but I can hear it when I listen back to the audio, where I start out really shaky, and that's me not regulating yet. And I can almost to the minute identify that's where you relax the muscles of your body. That's where you started regulating. And I can hear the difference. I don't know if people listening to it can necessarily identify it, but it's really, really helped me to be able to do that. Am I perfect at it? Absolutely not. I go to networking events and it initiates my panic response. That's a situation I don't know why. I don't know what the previous painful past learning around that was. But, I go to these networking events sometimes, and I end up standing in a corner by myself with like my cup of coffee, like, okay. And I'm nervous to talk to anybody. And I know I'm not in life-threatening danger, but I'm not regulating, right? The difference is, though, is that me of 5 years ago would have gotten back into my car and said some very mean things to myself about how I wasted my time and why did you even bother going? And that was ridiculous and blah, blah, blah. Now I have more compassion for myself, and I get in the car and I'm like, okay, you did not regulate at all. Like, there was no self-regulation happening. And if you decide to do another one of these, you really need to work on regulating before you get into the room, and continuing to regulate as you're there at the event. So I have more compassion for myself. That's one of the big things that I've learned through the process of my training.
I love that. And it just reminds me, like a conversation I had recently where I was like, it used to take me a week to get calmed down. Now it's down to a day. Maybe someday I'll get to an hour. And And the person I was talking to was like, let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's just like, so it's like these are things. And again, it's contextual, right? Like networking is different than a Zoom presentation, which is different than a coffee with someone that you're maybe just an acquaintance with, which is different than a friend, which is different than,
Yes.
So giving ourselves a little grace, I think, is a great place to end on. And Natasha, if people want to follow along with your work and see what you're up to or get in touch, where should they go?
So website is in progress. I don't have it's not live yet. So right now the easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn. Natasha D'Arcangelo. I always try to post whenever I have some kind of presentation or something coming up, or when the podcast gets published, I'll post the link for that for people to be able to get to. I am also available at Natasha, Natasha D'Arcangelo, which is tricky. So it's DARCANGELO@gmail.com. So if you have any questions about any of the resources that I mentioned or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. It is not a HIPAA compliant email, so please do keep that in mind. Don't send me any personal information on there. But if you're like, hey, you mentioned this book, but it went by too fast, definitely feel free to reach out. I'm happy to connect folks to resources.
Thank you so much. And we'll link all of that in the description. And Natasha, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. If you found this conversation to be helpful, please like and subscribe wherever you are listening. We also appreciate it if you take the time to leave us a review on iTunes. It really does help us spread the word and get these ideas out to more job seekers looking to build their careers and improve their lives just like you. If you'd like to learn more about career therapy and see our different coaching options, you can head over to careertherapy.com to learn more. Thank you again for stopping by. We wish you all the best in the future of your career. Have a good one.